Solar's just taking off the ground here at the moment. Germany, where we both come from, had that start almost 20 years ago. There is maybe some stuff that can be learned from what's happening in Germany over the years. There's maybe also some global trends when it comes to large-scale solar that not everybody's aware of. I'm going to quickly talk about the evolution of the German renewable energy market and what can be learned from this, and then Annette is going to tell us some things about utility scale solar in Germany today, and also like some global trends that hopefully are inspiring for everybody. Why did Germany ever start thinking of renewables? There was a strong environmental movement that started in the 80s. There was a lot of thinking about sustainable lifestyle, resources on the planet be limited. And in 1999, there was a green and red coalition ruling Germany. So like it was the first time that a green party anywhere on the globe, I think, was actually having ministers that would rule a country. And they just said sustainability for us means protecting the environment. Why we do that? Like we want to keep the planet also for the future generations and not just rape it and then throw it away, because then there is no place where we could be living. Globally, we saw in Germany grid parity in the years 2010 to 2012. Eventually, all these prices are going to be lower than any electricity generated from fossil fuels or from nukes. For the ones that are not familiar with what happened in Germany, maybe a quick recap. Germany started off with 3.4% of renewable electricity production in 1990, kind of 1995, 2000. And what you can see is it's mainly this blue, dark blue part. It was largely wind, it was largely hydro and a little bit of wind, that's the light blue, and a little bit of biomass, that is the green part. That was like how the renewables electricity production in Germany was made up before solar and wind really took off. And if you look at the development, basically what you can see is like for hydro, there was almost no growth possibility. So the main growth was biomass, wind, and then you can also see that solar has taken a significant share in the electricity production. So right now we have 43 gigawatt of PV power installed. If you see that the whole ASO pipeline at the moment is 4 gigawatts, like that's 10 times more, and it's 38 terawatt hours that are produced just by solar every year. And just to give a glimpse of how to get there, what helped the German PV market to lift off the ground? Germany had, after the Green government took over, they had a system in place that was a combination of feed-in tariff and sort of governmental sponsored loan or mortgage kind of thing for solar power providers. But then for 3 years, not much really happened. Like there was not much growth. And then in 2004, they just dropped all kind of incentives and they just made one thing. They just put in a feed-in tariff in place, and then the economical calculation was easy for everybody. And then it was just boom, like it just went. And then for many, many years, Germany was like the country that had seen most solar installations worldwide and the strongest growth. Interestingly enough, the feed-in tariff didn't need to be high, so it was constantly dropping. And with the market growing, what you can see here, this is the feed-in tariff dropping from 2004 to 2012. And here you can see the price development. PV installation costs dropped even more than the feed-in tariff that was dropping, because industry was just getting larger and larger, and economies of scale were actually showing up. And that also helped basically PV worldwide to take off the ground, because then suddenly other countries realized, hey, we got a lot of sun. Here it works even without any feed-in tariff or anything in place. Two things happened. The electricity prices in Germany were rising by 8 cents per kilowatt hour just for the renewable energies. And it's largely to the fact that at the beginning, the feed-in tariff was as high as 90 cents per kilowatt hour. That was just basically put on the bills of every electricity customer. And that was used as an argument against renewable energies in the long run. What had happened on the positive side is 120,000 jobs were created in solar only over that time. And it was also helping worldwide panel prices to drop. That's a development of the solar market in Germany. So until 2010, 11 and 12, you see there was like 7.5, 7.6 gigawatt of solar installed annually. And politicians realized that just reducing the feed-in tariff won't do the job to kill solar. So what they did is they brought in minimum import price for solar panels, or you could also call it an import duty for solar panels. So they fixed the price for solar panels, although the world market prices for solar panels were further dropping, and that basically made it impossible for guys that build solar to get down with the system prices even further. And then basically you see two effects: market over 2 years, 2013, 2014, dropping by 75%, which killed most of the company, and also 80,000 jobs. Here you can see what happens to the jobs. Like you see the rise until 2012, 120,000 jobs, and then 2015 down to 40,000. And sort of ironically, this was saving the remaining 20,000 jobs of guys working in brown coal. There is tons of implications if you go from 4% of renewables in the grid to 35 or 40%, and it's a major revolution to the grid. And I'm saying that because in Alberta that can happen much easier, because there is just less load on the grid. So if you build 4 gigawatt of solar, you're there pretty quick. So halfway down from 2000 to 2008, this graph shows typical week in summertime in Germany, and it's a load distribution in the grid from Monday to Sunday. What you can see basically is, first of all, you see on Monday, like the demand of the grid is really low. Then it rises until lunchtime. It drops down until the evening or the night. And then on Tuesday, kind of the peak is slightly different shape. So that's the demand basically. The demand needs to be satisfied. Where does the electricity come from? And what you can see is we have a base load that is nuclear fed and brown coal. Those power plants basically cannot switch them on and off as you like. So they basically deliver and you have to take somehow. That works still pretty well because the colors here, like blue color for wind, solar, yellow, biomass, green, they basically produce whenever they can. Like those renewables produce whenever they can, but they do not have a significant effect unless on the weekends where the load is lower, we have a lot of wind and quite a good sunshine. Then suddenly you see already that there's almost no mid-load and peak load power plants needed anymore. Mid-load and peak load power plants is the gray areas here. That was the situation in 2008. So since 2008, the development didn't stop. And the next slide is going to show what's happening when we reach 40% of renewables in the grid. Remember, we're at 36% in 2017, so we're almost there yet. Then you can see something. In this scenario, there is no place for coal, there is no place for nuclear anymore. Can imagine it's not just about 8 cents more on the electrical bills, it's also about the future of utilities. Like if they're largely liking the large power plants, they suddenly have a problem because all they can do is run like cogeneration or gas turbines to fill up this gray part, like mid-load, peak load. But there is just no place anymore for like those inflexible plants as nukes and brown coal-fired power plants. That's something that has to be looked at, that has been largely ignored by the renewable energies industry in Europe, and suddenly they were kind of surprised why they got so much lobbying against them. And it never should be forgotten that like the guys that run the big power plants, they got some money in their hands, and there is some of the guys here tonight, but like it would have made sense in a sense to have a dialogue at a very earlier stage of German development, it was a bit like the renewable guys on one end and the utilities on the other end. It would have been a much more sensible thing to sit down together and think about like what market mechanisms do we need to make like the game fair for everybody in a sense. If we want to go to 100% renewables in the grid, and this is something that eventually we have to do because oil and gas is limited, and we also will need oil for chemical industry, so we cannot just always burn it for electricity. Nuclear depends, it's worldwide depending on like how much the countries like it. Germany decided to exit nuclear power, and then it's not really a thinking option. What you always have is like the cheapest way of production is unfortunately ones that produce whenever they can. It's wind, it's solar, it's kind of biomass. You have the consumers that consume whenever they want, and then you have to fill the gap. For filling the gap, it needs basically 4 factors. One is you need power plants that are able to produce when it's needed. So we're talking about like biogas production, like you have like dung agricultural goods that are basically stuffed in I think it's called something like incubator, and then there's the gas coming out, you store the gas, and then you run your generator whenever it's needed. You have geothermal that can do the same, or also pump storage, hydro pump storage. There is still a large play field for storage in general that has to develop. And the other thing that works pretty well in Europe, and that I don't know how limited it is in North America, but like you can also shift loads between countries. Like for example, there was times in winter when we had little, like for whatever the reason, was very dry, and then like the rivers in France had very little water, so they had to shut down a lot of nukes. France is, I think, powered by 70% by nukes. And so for a while, German solar power was powering France, so that can also happen, and probably it works the other way around. So that comes into play. You definitely have a demand on have a very intelligent steering for all this, because suddenly we do not talk like about a handful of big power plants. We talk maybe just in Alberta, we might talk about like 100,000 or 200,000 power plants that need to be managed in a way that the grid stays stable the whole time and the consumers always get their electricity. And for that, also something that needs to change. What we saw is at the moment, as far as I'm concerned, in Alberta, like energy producers get just paid by the kilowatt hour just for the energy that they produce. But then what about if you have a controllable renewable energy production? And you have that capacities there, but then they idle for most of the year. So there must be also market mechanism for capacities in place. If not, the whole thing won't economically work. Germany doesn't have that in place as well, and it causes major issues. And I hand over to Annette.
So Stephan told you a bit about the general market mechanisms of going to renewable energy and how that's actually like what the Germans did well and what they didn't do so well, because that also exists. I want to tell you a little bit about how that relates to PV utility scale in detail, and also about what's happening worldwide on this. In Germany, what we see is that out of all the PV installations, we started out with very little utility scale in the first couple of years, up to, say, 2010. That's because the prices were still rather high back then. You saw earlier that the price drop, the massive price drop of module prices, installation prices, it only started 2011, 2012. And that's when it really started to make sense to go for utility scale plants, because before it was just not cost efficient and too expensive. So what happened then is that the amount of utility scale, and if I'm saying utility scale for German definition, I mean everything that's bigger than 1 megawatt and ground mounted. That's basically like, it's really hard to define because it's a bit different in every country. And like if you have space, as in Canada, 1 megawatt seems small, but for Germany, it's like pretty much that's how it's defined. And then just to see some numbers here in 2012, that amount of over 40% utility scale, that comes to 3 gigawatt that was built in 1 year. Then what happened? Why didn't it go higher, and why is it in total somewhere around 30% if clearly utility scale is cheaper to build than the residential and the commercial ones? Well, that's for the German case mostly due to governmental restrictions, because the Germans kind of tend to be a bit funny about not liking it and not liking to see it. They like to have it, but they don't like to see it. So they don't like to see it on rooftops, but even less, they like to see it on the ground. And there isn't that much free ground either. So what they always had is like they had zoning where utility scale could only go in specifically defined zones. And then the other thing they did when they saw these large amounts built 2012, 2013, like 2.5 gigawatts each year, they made it less attractive to do utility scale. They brought in a bidding procedure instead of feed-in tariff, starting at 750 kilowatt, so basically everything ground mounted, and going up to 10 megawatt, and beyond 10 megawatt, you wouldn't get any funding of the government anymore. And in this range, 750 to 10 megawatt, you would only get funding if you won the bidding process. They'd hold 3 rounds each year, February, June, and October, and give a total of 600 megawatt into that bidding process. So that was pretty much limiting also the amount built. So what we see here in the later years is always just an amount of 400 to 600 megawatt built. And why is it still that much, 30% and more? Well, that's because the market dropped to 1.5 gigawatt a year. What we see here is this 28% of the German, which is 12 gigawatt of the German PV, is utility scale. How does that work financially? The tendering procedure has actually had a quite interesting effect because it has reduced the prices paid for PV solar energy by almost 50% compared to the feed-in tariff before. So what we see here is the green line is the feed-in tariff for utility scale. So it's always been quite a bit lower than the feed-in tariff for rooftop and smaller installations because of the price difference. But then here, when they started with the tendering, in 2015, from then on it halved. So they started out with almost 14 cents per kilowatt hour that you would get in the bidding process, and over these 12 rounds they've now dropped down to an average of 6.5%, and that's like the pricing method is called uniform price pay as bid. So everybody who wins in this tender gets exactly the cent amount that they bid on with their project. So the highest would get maybe 7.5 and the lowest gets just below 6 cents in this case. So but what we can also see is the realization rate for this is still quite high. So 95% of what is won in these tenders is built at these prices, and we see it still pays off. So we're actually at a point where 6 cents, and this is Canadian cent, of per kilowatt hour is still cost efficient for a PV power plant. So I was hearing earlier that it's a 5 cent pool price average here, so we're not very far away from that. And then what's happening here is that with these prices, it's suddenly getting interesting in Germany. Even there is governmental funding in place to do PPAs. So power purchase agreements between the solar plant and an industrial off-taker, some utilities, become a new market mechanism. So we're really getting close to a free market, so to say. Have a look at worldwide development, because that's actually not very different from what's happening in Germany there. I brought you a few rough numbers, and I don't know how far you're familiar with that. The global PV installed right now is 403 gigawatt. That was end of 2017. I didn't have any 2018 numbers because it's not finished yet, but it will have increased. Germany accounts for 10% of that, around about. Canada, 2.9 gigawatt. That is not quite visible yet. Another thing that is interesting to see on this country as the countries that are now really adding a lot, like China, USA, India, they only started after the large price drop in panel prices has gone through. We told you earlier that was in the years 2011, 2012, and we see here that starting 2012, 2013, the big players of today, like China, USA, India, they come in. So they just started solar growth when it was becoming more and more cost efficient. So what else can we see here? I find it quite amazing to look at this number. China has built 130 gigawatt of solar, so that's about 1/3 of the global solar is standing in China today. How did they do it? I'll show that on the next chart. They had a feed-in tariff. What happened when they put the feed-in tariff away? That happened this year. Well, they kind of stopped. So it's going to be interesting to see what they're doing further on now. Another thing, coming to the large scale, is how much of this is actually utility scale. And you can see that this varies by countries quite a bit. I told you why Germany is so low with only 28% of large power plants, because they don't want it. Same kind of with Japan, but the countries that started later when it was more efficient to build large plants, they are going more for 3/4 or even up to 80% of utility scale. So starting solar now or looking into what solar is going to do worldwide and most likely in Alberta, I think the majority of it is going to be utility scale because it's just so much more sensible. Why would you do solar? Like, what's the financial revenue stream of it? And there we can see that the countries that really hit it off and that developed really fast, they had some sort of a governmental fund in place, because otherwise the market didn't take off. Not within the last years, not with the costs we have seen, with the prices we have seen. So usually it was a feed-in tariff, sometimes it was a combination out of a net metering, some funds there, some rebates, but something was there, and once it was taken away, it often happened that the market reacted very strongly to that. We've seen it in Germany, we've seen it in China, we've seen it in other countries. What's happening too is that the government are shifting more and more towards tendering procedures, because they of course also see that they're paying rather high prices, they're getting the solar they want, but it's not at market price. So they're trying to get the whole system of security for the solar industry to market price, which is kind of what's happening via a tendering procedure, right? Because everybody bids the price and the lowest price get the projects. What happens also, as I said that earlier, is that as the prices drop, the PPAs get more interesting. And what's also possible to do, and what's being done here, is to have PPAs with like local grid owners and local utilities, and also to use the carbon credits as a revenue source. So the next chart I'm going to show is probably going to be one of the most interesting ones. If you have the revenues, how does the cost structure look? What happened is on several levels. The first thing is that the panel prices has dropped, and on the international markets, they're as low as 30 Canadian cents right now. So this is not anything we're looking into future. This is as of today. And actually, it's not even as of today. It's as of October. So some of our sources in Germany have even seen lower prices already. So that's kind of crazy, seeing that here in Alberta, we're looking into like something 46 cents or even more. So just as a little outlook on that. And this is, like you can see here, so within 1 year, we've seen a price decrease of 30 to 50%, depending on the quality. And I mean, we're talking 2018, right? We're not talking 2010, 2012 anymore. So there's still a lot of air in this. And it's also predicted that this will continue. So we're not at the end of the price development for solar at all. The other thing is, in Germany today, you can build a utility scale system between 5 and 10 megawatt for 750 Canadian dollars or 75% per watt, and even lower actually, but that was the lowest number I was allowed to write down. So this is not very expensive compared to what we're looking into here, because in Alberta we're currently at like 145 cents per watt hour, and I'd say that's almost double of what you pay in Germany. So why is that? We did bring a little cost breakdown, which some of you might like. The modules for sure drive a lot of that part, because the procuring internationally is not something that's happening here so much, and it's also something that is not that easily done, because there's certifications, the CAS certification, etc., but still it's something that can be looked into and can be increased for sure in this market. And the other thing is, the other price driver here is, of course, the construction, installation, engineering work. So engineering-wise, what did the Germans do? Well, they kind of made it really simple. They started to do blocks of, like standard blocks of, say, 2 megawatt, 2.5 megawatt, and they just have their power plant a multiple of those blocks. So you wouldn't go into engineering for every project anymore. You'd just say, I have a 10 megawatt plant, I'll do 4 blocks of 2.5, and they all look the same. And you just put them beside each other, and then it's done. So that's fairly simple. You do the work once instead of every single time. And the other thing is the efficiency and construction site management. So some numbers, again, like a German EPC can build 5 megawatts within 3 weeks. And of course, they have their machinery run all the time. So that's like, it's not stopping, it's not standing, it has a very, very little idle times on that for the teams, for the machinery, and that can be moved around. So there's some cost efficiencies that may not be able to realize here, but it's still something worth looking into. After this, I would like to end with some technology trends that we see worldwide. And some of these are probably already quite wide known. So what's happening as we match the solar plants more to demand and pool prices than to maximum yield is we're going from south facing to east-west facing. Because this just really helps when you have the midday peak to have your production shift more to the side of the day. So you can see here, like it's starting earlier, it's ending later, you have a less high peak. The other thing is in terms of technology is the use of bifacial modules, which are increasing the yield by up to 25%, depending, of course, on the ground you have below the model. So it has to be highly reflective. The more reflective, the more it increases your yield. But especially on tracking, single-axis trackers on ground-mounted, we see that already quite a lot happening, that people use like bifacial modules. The third thing that is yield-wise has the biggest impact is the tracking. So tracking means you don't put your models on a like solid rack, which is always facing the same direction, but you have a single or dual axis tracker which moves the models as the sun moves. The single axis tracker can bring you up to 25-35% more revenue, and adding the second axis to the dual axis tracker, we're even talking up to 45%. And does that make sense? Is that worthwhile? That really highly depends on the cost of the racking. So how much more does it cost you in the construction to put a tracking system in? Is it worth it? Is it covered by the extra revenue? Yes or no? And we're bringing this also because there is some racking manufacturers that I know of that are actually now bringing out racking systems that for single axis tracking that are at the same price as the no tracking ones. So we're definitely looking into some surprises on that end within the next couple of years, because I don't think it's going to be so much longer that this is out because of price issues. Yeah, one more thing on the racking materials used. I just found that kind of neat and interesting. You probably mostly used is steel, aluminium, depending on what's more expensive in the worldwide market right now. There's also some manufacturers, very rare, that use wood. So it's always worth looking into other options that are there. And another one that is just as neat, floating solar. I don't know if you've seen that. Japan is quite big in that. So and also in Brazil it's built, so they use lakes instead of ground for the mounting. The last trend here is the mobile solutions, which is actually something, it's like one of my favorite topics. Found at the last seminar here and afterwards that there's actually one right here, so the solar C-can. So I love that because it's you also did like a solution that can go into its C-can and can come out, can be moved to a construction site where you need it. If you don't need it, you pack it, you move it. So that's really neat. Stuff like that is coming up. And we have a little more, let's say, more elaborate version of that. That's the mobile solar power product, and it's kind of a bit more stationary. So you use the C-can, it's in as a mounting system. You mount it all around. The C-can is painted with a highly reflective color. You have bifacial modules, and so all sides kind of produce. And you can even use the C-can is used for storage, or even like in African countries, so something neat as a medical station, or a cooling station, or a supermarket. So there's some really interesting stuff happening here. And also I think for Alberta and Canada in general, the mobile solutions can be something that's really interesting for remote sites. And one more thing that I find very, why it's so worthwhile to think about these mobile stuff is if you're going into the free market and you're possibly not able to get a power purchase agreement on your solar project for, let's say, 20 years, well, then you may get one for 5 or for 10, and then you just put it all back into the container and move the system to somewhere else where you have the next power purchase agreement. That's also an option that is coming up on this, and which is why I think it's really worth to look in these global trends when we're talking about how can we make solar worthwhile.
Definitely we're in much advantageous position because of the timing. We're getting into the solar market and solar development at the time when solar prices are so low and so competitive compared to the grid. And that's kind of the purpose of my presentation. I just like to go reviewing 3 provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia, and see how close we from, I think, $40 per watt installed cost is fairly attainable in Alberta, and understanding the reasons how it can be lowered and how the cost of solar could be more cost effective is one of the key goals. Today we're going to talk about utility scale projects in Western Canada that's been already built or already committed to. Then we're going to review government regimes that create opportunities. We'll talk about levelized cost of solar in 3 provinces. We will consider Brooks solar project as a case study, and we'll see some short video. And we talk about sustainable development of the solar farms. So this slide shows what has been built today. Moving from east to west, the first project that I'd like to cover is Sun Mine. And I just want to say that this information is based on the public sources, which often do not specify AC or DC capacity of the projects. And that's kind of a challenge. So, you know, where I knew information where it's DC capacity or AC, I specified it, but otherwise it's a little bit confusing. So moving from west to east, the first Sun Mine project was built in 2015. It was built at almost record high price, $5.3 per watt, which reflects cost of dual access trackers and very complicated foundations and soil conditions. It was built with as a partnership between City of Kimberley and Teck with substantial funding. Without substantial funding, the project could not be economical. The $2 million came as a funding from Teck, $1 million came from Clean Energy Fund, and $300,000 from Columbia Basin Trust. Next project that was that's kind of I think finishing up construction right now. It's a Tsilhqot'in First Nation project. It's proceeded under micro standing offer program in British Columbia, and the budgeted price is $2.4 a watt. Maybe potentially it's going to increase a little bit high in the future because of the complicated soil conditions that they experienced at the site. Once completed, the project will have power purchase agreement with BC Hydro. Western Diversification Fund provided $1 million towards this project. However, because of very remote location and the line that goes to Bella Coola, the project is almost feasible because it provides the energy where it's required. Next one, we're going to move to Alberta. So last year, Alberta built the biggest project in Western Canada, which is 17 megawatt DC capacity elemental Brooks solar project. Estimated cost was $2 per watt DC capacity. And you can see it when you drive from Calgary to Medicine Hat on the north side of the Highway 1. The project is connected to the Fortis distribution line. There is a corporate off-taker, so it's a PPA agreement. The way how the project could be economical of that scale is that Emission Reduction Alberta funded $15 million towards the project, make it economically feasible. Again, same pattern, without substantial funding, the project would not be economical in the Alberta market. Next project is Green Acres Colony, built 2 megawatt Bassano project as 2 microgeneration projects. And at that time, funding in the Growing Forward program or other programs were capped. So at that scale level, I don't think they received much funding, and based on the market prices where they are, project likely is not quite economical for the owner. The installed cost $2.8 a watt, which is again kind of a little bit on the high side compared to nowadays, but was competitive back in 2015. Next project is 1 megawatt City of Calgary project in Shepherd facility. This project received municipal solar program funding. If assuming that it's tapped to this funding, then it's going to be profitable for the City of Calgary at $2.4 a watt installed capacity. Finally, in Saskatchewan, we got announcement for the Highfield 10 megawatt solar project to be built, and the installed cost was announced publicly $1.5 per watt. And that's, I think, where kind of market more or less right now currently. With that, it's been, as Stephan said, it was competitive process, bidding process, where developer came up with the lowest price. So I do believe that this project would be economically feasible both for developer and SAS Power Corporation, who issues the power purchase agreement based on the lowest price offered on the marketplace. So if we go through all these projects in the past, you can see that fairly substantial funding been enabling those projects to proceed, except perhaps one of them is Saskatchewan, that's in the early stages of the construction currently. So now I'd like to go through the provinces, see what's available in the marketplace. And interesting that compared to Germany, Germany is a large country with just one structure, market structure, just one model. So basically, if it's an energy market or if it's capacity market, it applies for the same country. So here we have a very interesting model where we're located in Alberta, but we look at our neighbor to BC, and it's a completely different market than here. It's completely regulated. We look at Saskatchewan, it's again different market. So I think, Annette, I really like your idea. You can basically build your mobile station and move from province to province depending on where the price is higher. It's actually doable because the market's completely different, Whatever happening in Alberta may not necessarily be reflected in BC and such. So, and with that, I started with BC, British Columbia, which, I'm kind of thinking that the most, tree huggers and, lots of, nature and really beautiful province. But from utility scale solar perspective, they're fairly silent. So there was a standing offers and micro standing offers program that proved lots of hydro projects, and the only one project that I could publicly found is 15 megawatt project close to Cranbrook. That's on hold right now, so there's nothing kind of on the solar side, utility scale solar side has been built. So I just heard two days ago that, or yesterday, that they announced a clean energy plan, nuclear energy plan, so maybe that would bring more utility scale solar or may change outlook for solar in general in the province. Now moving on to Alberta. As you know, we have Alberta government RFP for the Alberta buildings covering 55% of the load consumption by the solar. And depending on capacity factors, depending on location, so we expect about 80 to 90 megawatts of solar coming in by 2020. Next one is Alberta energy efficiency programs, which would include small residential commercial projects, but recently the limit has been announced, raised, of funding up to $1 million. So that would actually enable, say, larger scale, more than 1 megawatt projects to be receiving this incentive. So, we can consider that it's going to help on the large scale projects, for the large scale project as well, to be economical. And kind of roughly estimated based on the level of $36 million available in the program, and with the current incentives and about maybe a third of the program or maybe less subscribed nowadays, about 40 megawatt will probably come in 2020. Then next one is, I would like to talk about municipal projects and utility owned. And I just looked at plans for City of Calgary and basically EPCOR what's doing. Perhaps there is more that I'm not aware on utility scale, and I estimated about 20 megawatts would come from there. And also there is huge opportunities for the corporate off-takers in Alberta, and that's what drives quite a high queue in ASO for the solar projects of 4 gigawatt. So there is appetite on the market to, to start developing of the projects in anticipation that levelized cost of solar will drop, but will drop to the point where it's going to be feasible and comparable with the and with electricity prices going up, so there will be some sort of grid parity. So that's what we have in Alberta. So compared to BC, fairly nice and good picture. We're talking about tens of megawatts and maybe potentially 4 gigawatts compared to just British Columbia. Now our neighbors on the east in Saskatchewan, so they came up with the road plan where we define that 20 megawatts of solar will come from competitive RFPs, 20 megawatts of solar will come from the First Nations Power Authority, and 20 megawatts going to be power generation partners programs. And they plan to break it down in 2019, bring first 10 megawatt and then another 10 megawatt in 2020. And across all these provinces, I mean, Saskatchewan is really already ahead of, because they already approved one first project, 10 megawatt project under competitive RFP. Unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to find a PPA price. It's really intriguing what's actually the true cost of solar nowadays in the Western Canada. And they also announced a fairly interesting power generation partner program where we'd allow smaller guys to up to 1 megawatt to generate and interconnect to the grid. 3 different regimes, 3 different opportunities. So you just pick today is this place, tomorrow is that place, and I can confirm from my side as well. We do travel between 3 provinces quite a bit, and trying to find the values and maximizing the opportunities for the clients. So with that, maybe I'll even go back and just kind of ask you the question: what do you think? Whether these programs are really, provides too much subsidies for the solar or not. If you look at the previous slide, when we considered the history, it was almost like cash and tax rebates and something being just thrown into the projects to get them off the ground. Now, what you can see right now in the policy-regulated solar programs is quite a bit of change. We can see that, you know, the regulation is changing towards competitive PPAs and things like that, rather than just putting the pure funding to get the projects off the ground, which is really good. And on that, I want to ask the question, you know, whether actually solar is close to be, you know, going by itself without any substantial subsidies. So here we have, I built a levelized cost of solar compared to electricity prices for 3 provinces. So we'll start from Alberta. And so the red dots is levelized cost of solar based on $1.4 per watt DC plus cost of connection. And I varied it a little bit irradiances, and I varied it a little bit connection cost based on the provinces, based on the recent programs that's been available in the provinces. And the green line here is determined in the top, the high price and the low price. So in Alberta example, what I've done is, so here's the high price is determined as 2019 on-peak price plus carbon capture price of about $20 per megawatt hour. So that's determined in the high price. The low price is determined by just 2018 on-peak price. So you see, this is market characteristics that describe the range. And I'm not one who tell where it's going to go, but I mean, like, this is the range where it is. And based on this installed cost and distribution connection costs, the solar is on the high side of that range. So obviously, if the solar continue dropping down, there will be some margin or internal rate of return on investment to make for the developers, and it would, you know, just get the solar off the start. But the good thing, it's already within the range. In Saskatchewan, I took the high price, I took power generation partner program price, and then on the low side, SaskPower says that 27% of their power bill is actually energy component, and the rest is delivery charges. So I'm assuming utility scale solar are not going to be distributed generation. So I determined the low point. So you can see that levelized cost of solar is, first of all, in Saskatchewan a little bit lower than in Alberta, because they have a little bit better resource, and compared to the forest, maybe slightly better interconnection costs. So there is a potential, you know, for the developer to make some margin, since there is a, you know, this area of the graph. And in British Columbia, what I've done is, for the high, I considered standing offer for East Kootenay. So it was a standard offer program, determined $109 per megawatt hour price. And on the low side, I took how much there is a big hydro dam site C is built, and you know, there's speculation that the cost of that site going to be $85 per megawatt hour. So that's what I took as a bottom line. And still, like, you know, solar right now in BC is fairly competitive, if within this range. So this graph shows to me that, you know, we're not too far apart for utility solar to take off and develop in all these 3 provinces, with the right regulation and with the right incentive to, you know, for developers to compete on the price and, you know, get the price down as much as possible. So then I would like to talk about quickly about our case study, Solar Brooks project. So our company last year take part in the construction. So our role was doing layout, pile driving, pre-drilling, and you know, gravel distribution. And that 17 megawatt project took us 3 months in the field to do that part of work. And overall construction took about 6 months. So the learnings that from that project quickly is, you know, that scale of the project with the proper, you know, paralleling and things could be fairly possible doing it. Then we did focus on bringing local resources, local labor, and train local labor to execute the project. And so the project was executed on time, on the budget. And there's lots of different, you know, other things that, you know, interesting about. But I'll probably 3 months for us, and then 6 months to construct. So it started. We started with layout in July 4th, and it's finished slightly after New Year. So about 6 months. So yeah, so the first stage is lay out all these piles, and then we did pre-drilling. Then we put PVC sleeves, and this is the pile driving. So it's actually me doing pile driving. And this is the scale of the project. 5,400 something. So you'll find out that actually most of the projects completed in Western Canada, one of the challenges and learning experience is that developer has no clue what's underground. And that causes extreme price for the installed capacity. So in this particular case, the soil was so loose that in order to get any skin friction and protect the piles from the frost heave, it's necessary to pre-drill the frost to the frost depth and fill with the pea gravel to eliminate any frost heave action, and then rely on the skin friction for the piles below 1.7 meters. And these piles were 6.1 meter long, so it's extreme long piles that probably you don't ever see in Germany. That's another reason why costs are higher. Okay, yeah, so it's 5,398 piles. Thank you, Rocky. Thank you, everybody. All right, so, and just as a segue to the next presenter, I just want to share, my experiences, personal kind of experiences developing solar farms in an environmentally sustainable way. As I said, like we travel quite a bit, and we bought the land in Saskatchewan where we kind of building small family solar farm for ourselves, and that encouraged us to kind of learn about particular grass. So what I learned is that in Alberta we have only 26% of the native prairie grass saved, and in Saskatchewan only 21% of the land is actually have native prairie grass, and everything else has been affected by agriculture and industrial and the urban developments. So one of the things that I thought that I could do differently is we basically learned first what kind of grass grows in our land, and secondly, anything that was damaged by the construction or previous use of the land, we replanted the grass. Then figured out that by installing chain link fence, which you can see that we've been installing here, is actually prevents any invasive species to come inside. So once you get rid of all invasive species inside your property, then you kind of the chain link fence prevents for other invasive species to come in and spread. And I think that's the plan, that we would like to retain the nature and retain the the prairie nature of that land. So if this 4 gigawatt of solar goes ahead, and the developers would understand, one of the lessons that we learned is that the grading is not necessary. You can choose the racking depending on the site. And 2 days ago I was installing ground mount solar on extremely hilly side, and it still looks pretty good. You just need to have the right racking and the right installers to do so. And then if you avoid the grading, then you can preserve the natural native grass, and you don't need to replant too much, and you have less shading with foundation design as well, because undisturbed soil has a better capacity than disturbed soil. So then another thing that we learn is that PV modules can provide a partial shade for the grass, which would be good. I mentioned about the chain link, and then we did replanted native grass in the disturbed by construction areas. And then finally, if there is a water available at the site, or if there's a well or something, then it's absolutely perfect for sustainable sheep grazing. And on technology side, I just want to kind of give a challenge that when we're building large scale solar farms, there's impact of clipping, inverter clipping. When the DC capacity is higher than inverter capacity, so there is some of energy that just cannot go and be produced and used in the system, sold back to the system. So one of the idea that I would like to try out is I would like to build a DC controller that's basically every time when inverter clipping is just take the energy on DC side and, for example, use this for water pumping to whatever water plants or create the water for the livestock.
And that's something that, there's lots of opportunities on technology side to make things not only making from the money side perspective, but, contributing to environment. And, I know that, lots of people thinking, oh, utility scale, it's like more industrial and things, but it's really depends on the people's attitude and how they, get into that. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting EPCOR to present on this project this evening and be part of this evening. I have the opportunity to present on the Smith Solar Farm project, a project we've proposed, which will be creating clean water with clean power, so something very unique. I'm sure many have heard of EPCOR, but if you haven't, a brief background is we're headquartered here in Edmonton. We were incorporated in 1996. And we're 100% owned by the City of Edmonton, though with a fully independent board of directors that operates kind of at arm's length from the city. Now within EPCOR Utilities, there's a number of business units, one of them being EPCOR Water Services, and we're the regulated water utility here within the City of Edmonton, providing clean water to customers in Edmonton and surrounding areas. And we operate under a performance-based regulation with the city that holds us to achieve certain performance metrics. Now, as a company that takes water from the river, treats it, and provides drinking water to the public, EPCOR Water is an environmental and public health company. Our health, safety, environment plan does have an objective at a high level of reducing pollution and minimizing our harm to the environment. And there's many examples where EPCOR has been recognized a leader in these areas. So one of the things we've taken action on is to look at how we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And this has led to a couple environmental initiatives in our current performance-based regulation that was approved by City Council back in 2016. Both of those, or two of those environmental initiatives, one of them being to convert 10% of our current power consumption at EPCOR water facilities in Edmonton to a renewable source. And secondly, another initiative to develop a river monitoring program for the North Saskatchewan River. Both of these initiatives were approved, and funding was approved as part of this PBR agreement, and results in about a 10 to 15 cent increase on the average water customer's water bill, here in the Edmonton area. So there's this project that I'll get into right away that allows EPCOR to meet its commitment in this PBR agreement. So the objective of this project, the proposed solar farm at Smith, is to generate renewable energy to help power the existing water treatment plant and its water treatment and distribution processes. There's large pumps, for example, at the site to pump water to around the city. So it's a very energy intensive process. So we want to do this while reducing our carbon footprint. So overall, the project proposed is a 12 megawatt AC project that'll include up to 45,000 panels on the 56 acres of land, which I'll speak a bit more about later. It'll produce overall about over 21,000 megawatt hours in the first year. This is, for perspective, equivalent to about powering over 2,800 kind of average Alberta homes annually in Alberta. What is unique for this project, unlike other utility scale projects that we've heard about already this evening, is this is connected to a large load, a large facility behind the power meter or revenue meter. So it's powering the water plant directly, where majority of the power that's generated for the solar plant will feed into the water treatment facility. Obviously, solar may generate more power than the water treatment plant needs at certain times, so the remainder electricity will be exported back into the grid. We anticipate up to about 70% of the power generated by solar will be used on site. A couple other details, technical arrangements is the site will be a ground-mounted and fixed-tilt solar panel racking system, be secured into the ground with screw-in type piles. There'll be central inverters together with transformers that are within the solar farm area. Now, a bit more about the location. As you can see in the bottom left image there, the site for the solar farm is between the water treatment plant, which is to the north, and the Anthony Henday Drive to the south, which is within the transportation utility corridor. So this land was transferred from the city to EPCOR in the 90s for use as future water treatment plant expansion. Now, more efficient water treatment and decreasing customer consumption have deferred the need to use this land right now for water treatment expansion for at least the 30-year plus time frame that the solar farm will be designed to last. So it's really an interim use of this site until that land is needed. Just another perspective, I'm sure most are from Edmonton, or those that I guess are live potentially. The site is within the large Edmonton area, which is quite unique as well, and we think it really provides accessibility to the general public, to people to learn about renewable energy technology, to start a dialogue and discussion about it as well. These photos are just artistic renderings of what it may look like. It may be hard to see. And now how it will work, I think many of you are more solar experts than I am, but in case not, we'll start at the top left in the sky where the sun is. That's shining down on the panels. That will generate DC electricity going into the central inverter stations with transformers that are within the solar farm area. These will convert the DC to AC electricity. It'll transform that power up to the 13.8 kV voltage that we need to supply the switchgear at our plant site. Now, if the water plant is needing that power, it'll feed directly into the water plant. If not, it'll be exported to the grid. And obviously, when the sun isn't shining or at nighttime, we'll be getting power from the grid to continue making clean water. Now, as this project is within a large city area, we looked at and evaluated how this project would align with some of the City of Edmonton's sustainability, land management, and recreation strategies. Now, we kind of categorized them into two buckets. This doesn't show all the different policies we reviewed, but the two groups are mainly creating a sustainable and resilient city, as well as protection and responsible use of the river valley. Now, in the first bucket, this project aligns in that it's adding distributed renewable generation to the city. It's local within the City of Edmonton area, as well as additional, adding new infrastructure, new renewable technology. Now, in regards to the second bucket, I want to just emphasize that EPCOR agrees that protection of the river valley and its natural asset is a critical importance, and this will only be maintained if it's used in a responsible manner. And like I've shown already, many of EPCOR's critical assets, the two water treatment plants, for example, are within the river valley, and EPCOR continually operates in a responsible way. Now, EPCOR has had an extensive number of independent scientific assessments done for the site, which has been needed for our regulatory applications as well, which I'll touch on a little bit. And based on the assessments to date and what's been looked at, the Smith Solar Farm project not only results in no significant environmental impacts, but it greatly aligns with some of the uses and desires in the city policies for connecting projects with the community, providing awareness, providing education. Now, digging in a little bit deeper to the first grouping of sustainability and resiliency. So as I said, EPCOR wanted to take their action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The top left graph explains and shows how the EPCOR Edmonton operations, where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. The blue part of each of the bars is from EPCOR's water treatment, so that's the drinking water, the greenhouse gas emissions. The green part is from our wastewater treatment processes, and then the red is from all the other operations within EPCOR. So as you can see, the EPCOR water portion, about 58% of our greenhouse gas emissions is just from the water treatment processes. Adding wastewater, that increases to about 90%. The bottom left graph shows the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that EPCOR has achieved since 2008, and that's primarily through building retrofits and operational efficiencies. So we've been able to reduce those emissions by about 10%. Now, we'll only be able to accomplish so much by just looking at the consumption side. So EPCOR is taking this next step to further reduce those emissions by changing our energy sources to renewables. So the E.L. Smith Solar Project will reduce those emissions within the Edmonton area by about 12%, And projecting that out to 2020, just for Edmonton water operation, that's about 24% reduction. Just touching on a bit about the responsible use of the river valley, I want to highlight one of the policies that we looked at, and that's the citywide approved BREATHE strategy, which talks about protection and responsible use of the river valley and includes policies in regards to ecological integrity, education, awareness, vibrant places, and public access and connectivity. In addition to this, there's also the draft Ribbon of Green plan. So that's somewhat at a high level, a plan to connect the entire river valley area. And this plan currently identifies the area for the water treatment plant and the solar farm, which is in purple on the map on the left, has an active and working landscape. Now, this classification is based on a number of scientific studies of the river valley, and our assessment of this aligns with the assessments that we also had done independently. Now, the list of compatible uses for this area is such facilities that we are talking about, like solar farms on disturbed sites, which this land is. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the regulatory process, and then we'll jump back a little bit more to the trails and connection to the community. So the regulatory processes, there's two main ones that we're currently still going through, and that's the Alberta Utility Commission. Now, this commission provides the approvals to construct and operate any power facility, among other things, in the province. So we've submitted a facility application to the AUC. That has required us to do some public engagement, which I'll touch on briefly in a bit, as well as numerous environmental, historical resource impact assessments, technical studies, and many other project details that we've had to submit to them. Secondly, there's the City of Edmonton. In order to build a solar farm within this land, we're required to rezone the land, as well as to get an amendment to the area redevelopment plan for the river valley. This also has a public engagement process and will ultimately go to a public hearing at City Council. Following that, there's the development and construction permits. So as I said, there was a significant amount of public engagement that's been required for this project, both from the AUC as well as in alignment with the City of Edmonton public engagement policy. Specifically, the AUC required us for this type of facility to contact all landowners within the 2-kilometer radius of the site. So that being in an urban environment, that resulted in over 17,000 residents being notified. In addition to that, within the smaller 800-meter radius, we either door knocked, called, mailed, whatever it took to get in touch with those landowners. Now, from that, there was oral or written engagement with over 720 participants, including 230 who made actual comments. Now, a majority didn't support or oppose. Approximately 10% expressed support and less than 1% expressed opposition. We also reached out to numerous special interest groups, community groups, which I know some are represented here today, to engage them in the process. Last year as well, EPCOR elected to begin meaningful Indigenous consultation with a variety of groups. We reached out and sent project information to 21 different nations, of which 13 responded and expressed interest to learn more about the project. So they are engaged through site visits, meetings, information exchanges, and active participation in the historical resource impact assessments. Now, this was quite unique for EPCOR, the first time this was done, and we received a lot of positive feedback that they appreciated being part of those impact assessments, as well as being able to share a bit about their history through that process. Now, EPCOR is continuing to consult and engage with those groups in further planning. Now, as I mentioned already, I think this is a very unique, being tied to a water plant in a large urban area. So there are a number of exciting community opportunities that we are developing with key stakeholders that are unique to this project. One item is EPCOR is committed to providing easements for future river valley trails on its land, and to work with the city to determine the optimum alignments for these trails. Again, on that map, the purple area is the water treatment plant and the solar farm. And as you can see on both sides of it in light green, this is where the city has proposed a trail alignment. So we're working with stakeholders to refine ideas around a unique interpretive site of some sort located along these trails or together with our proposed solar farm. It could provide a storytelling platform for Indigenous communities to share the rich history of this river valley and cultural significance. And the site will provide trail users and E.L. Smith visitors with unique opportunity to learn about renewables, as well as learn about the water treatment plant and the whole life cycle. Currently, EPCOR hosts tours of our water treatment plant for school groups. So we feel this is also, again, a good opportunity to show them how we are creating clean water with clean power. I liked Mikhail's few points on his last slide about sustainable development as one of our community integration objectives, as well as to also explore how we can improve aesthetics, whether that be some natural screening, looking at enhancing the vegetation that's there. Currently it's non-native. So to look at how we can improve the site through this project. Now, EPCOR is also looking at and actively working on with post-secondary institutions to develop partnerships and opportunities to research or study together with this project. Again, there's significant interest around this style of intermittent generation connected to a large load and the opportunities for that. And for those that have been following the media, just last week, there's an exciting announcement by National Resources Canada, as well as Alberta Innovates, that they're providing funding to install a smart grid system at this site. This is really an enhancement to the solar farm to include a utility scale battery energy storage system, together with intelligent controls. Now this is, from what I've seen, one of a first for this type of infrastructure at a water treatment plant. I think there's significant learning and opportunities and research for this type of system. There are many opportunities how we can use the batteries that we're still being looked at, but it has opportunity to provide additional resiliency for the water treatment plant. It'll even provide opportunities for the plant to operate for a short period of time if there's grid power loss, as well as other operational efficiencies. So lots has been going on for the past couple years. And to close out the presentation, just to touch on a couple of the next steps and proposed timeline. Obviously, as I've highlighted, the regulatory process are still in progress with the AUC and the City of Edmonton. We're continuing to engage with any stakeholders, the public, whoever may have questions or comments regarding the project. We have started some initial design and planning for procurement and construction. And now with the recent announcements, we're looking at how we can incorporate and integrate the smart grid system into our overall project plan. For the solar farm, if the project is approved early next year, we hope to start construction shortly after and have the solar farm portion completed by the end of the year. So again, thank you for your time.
A question for the gentleman from EPCOR. I noticed that your system is a fixed rack system, fixed rack tilt system, I think it's called. And I noticed from one of the slides of one of the previous presenters that the dual axis articulating racking system can achieve up to 45% more efficiency. I'm just wondering why the articulating racking system is not being considered by EPCOR, because this seems to be a state-of-the-art exercise.
Yes, that's a good question. So early on, and in discussions with our consultants, as well as in discussion and visiting other solar farms in Ontario that had racking, we learned that in types of climates, such as Edmonton's, there are challenges. And as a first project for EPCOR in this area, there are some risks there with O&M and lots of moving parts that we were concerned about and didn't want to proceed with. So really an O&M consideration.
And I just add two things, like you to make the dual axis trackers efficient, you need a lot of space. So you have like space constraints where you are building. Like if you have really open space, you can like have more distance between the trackers, one thing. And then the second thing is that the tracking technology for dual axis tracking is currently really expensive. So economically it doesn't make so much sense. While the single axis tracking is approaching close to the ground mount racking, which might be more interesting, but then again, it's a different story. You have moving parts which can be like a downside.
Mikhail?
Yeah, the choice between a single access tracker or fixed, it's really specific to the site, so you need to look at the site specifics. As Stephan mentioned, usually the ground coverage ratio, you can build more with the fixed tilt rather than with the single axis. Then if there is any substantial angulation, like if the rolling hills or things like that, it's better to do with the fixed tilt than with the single axis. And maybe on the single axis, I would throw as a question, if you considering the battery storage, single axis would give you a little bit wider distribution of the energy generation, so which could be beneficial and save you on the battery cost.
I have a question for Mikhail. In regards to the Brooks facility, when you were discussing the financing and the per watt cost that you identified for us, are you counting the federal government funding against that in order to lower the cost? Or how did you compute that, please?
The Brooks project doesn't belong to us. It belongs to Elemental, who is developer. So in terms of financing, yes, they did secure financing. It was definitely outside of my scope to comment on how they secured financing. But looking from, there was a funding that came from Carbon Capture Management Corporation, which is Alberta emissions reductions right now, which constitute almost to 50% of the capital cost of the project, right? So even if you sell back to the power pool at the current market rates with the 50%, close to 50% funding, it's fairly lucrative. So even though, Alberta actually provides a really unique challenge for financing any projects because from financing perspective, bankers would like stability, so power purchase agreement or something stable where the price is fixed through the life of the project and no escalation. In Alberta, if project is output of the project is sold back to the market, it's extremely volatile and really difficult to finance. Again, I guess it's doable, but as Elemental showed and proved it, but it's challenging for sure.
For the gentleman from EPCOR, I've scoured your website and documentation and everything, and I haven't seen any indication of what's the PV array capacity. You say 12 megawatts AC, which is of course the inverter capacity, but there's nothing that indicates what's the array capacity. Can you comment on that? Or you said 45,000 PV modules, but what's the array capacity?
Yeah, so part of that is it wasn't finalized until we started to the detailed design because obviously panel technology I'm learning is changing rapidly. What I could say is it's in the average of a 1.3 overbuild. So we're looking at around that 16,000 megawatt DC, but largely dependent on panel costs and market changes right now.
Do you think you'd still, though, with a 1.3 stacking ratio, do you think you'd really still get 21.5 gigawatt hours of electrical energy per year?
That's what the analysis and the calculations have showed us, yes. Now, I'm not the PV-syst expert here or the analysis expert, but we're relying on those that are experienced and looking at various models and configurations that have shown that this energy generation is achievable.
The key, though, is what's the snow cover? And you can't say there's no snow cover, of course, so it's really important to use reasonable estimates for snow cover.
Yes, I guess on snow cover, one of the tools or inputs we've used is the NATE study in terms of how many clearings and the comparison of what's been cleared and non-cleared, as well as other weather data.
Sure, which is great, and I designed the system at NATE. And the key thing is that it's on a 3-story building next to a windswept airport, so it's not really very relevant to a ground mount in a river valley. Just say it.
Thank you.
One of the wildlife directives for the Alberta government is that solar shouldn't be, as they put it, in valleys of a large permanent watercourse. And I think that's probably for, wildlife movement reasons. But I was sort of curious, and with the EPCOR is wanting to put it right next to the river. It's in a zone parkland right now. But it has to do maybe with the culture in Germany, because Stephan and is it Annette, both you kind of spoke about the culture of where solar goes and how people feel about it. And there's also the notion that, you know, in Canada there's a lot more land, and I think that we might be a little bit more like, you know, cowboys out here when it comes to land. But so I'm curious to kind of know, yeah, what is the culture in Germany when it comes to siting solar?
Yeah, like in general, like the last zoning that we had was that you were allowed to be within a certain distance from highways and train tracks. So it was, I think, like something like 100 meters or like 300 feet, 350 feet, something like that, which was the maximum distance allowed. So what you were trying to get is like this land corridor between the highway and like 300 feet away, and that's then where the solar would go, which was great for solar because then driving along the highways you would see a lot of solar, and it would give you the impression that Germany must be full of solar. So that was a nice side effect, and in a way, and the interesting thing is what gets completely forgotten about that is like nobody's zoning so much about agriculture in Germany. Like you can have farms everywhere, and like if you do monoculture of certain crops, like nature's zero there. And what we can see is like there is a lot of biodiversity if you play it right in solar farms, and there is even, like, depending on how you do the fencing, there's even wildlife getting in and out. So. But yeah, that's just like, it depends who's making the decisions.
You guys talked about dual and single axis trackers. What's the source of these trackers? So do you have to provide any auxiliary power, or does the source come from the module itself? And is it rated for -40? I mean, is it rated for something for an environment similar to Alberta?
There is a lot of technologies out there. I don't think it's good to mention company names on stage here. Or like I don't want to make marketing for any of those, but like one Canadian subsidiary of a European company, they tried and tested a single axis tracker over 3 years now under really harsh environmental conditions. And the bearings that they were using for the single axis tracker, they're like in a way really stable and shouldn't have much wear and tear. And then again, probably you cannot just take any technology, move it here, and then suddenly be surprised of like, oh wow, it doesn't survive the environmental conditions here. So I think it cannot be generalized. It would, on that end, it's good to look at references, like, do those guys have references that meet like similar climate conditions?
And what is the source for these trackers?
Like power source?
Yeah, power source.
Depends. Typically, like I mean, the systems are made in a way that they, first of all, really consume very, very little energy, because like each tracker ideally is balanced in a way that you, like, either way, however you move it, you don't have to push a big weight basically. And then, as far as I'm concerned, it's typically DC. I think they take the DC power right away, but like, I didn't go in an analysis of all the systems that are out there.
You said that you wanted to plant native grasses on your own personal solar farm, which is very laudable, but I think that's extremely difficult to do. Even the conservationists, the restorationists can't recreate prairies very easily, or at least without a lot of effort. And I'm afraid I just don't quite buy this notion that you can use solar farms to increase biodiversity. What I can see on the screen is very large tracts of agricultural land, or in the case of EPCOR, it will be River Valley parkland, that are going to be taken up by these solar panels. I can't see where there's going to be room for biodiversity. So I would say, you know, to what extent could we switch over from this utility scale to the brownfields, which also might be utility scale, and the rooftops, and still have, you know, economic solar power generation?
Okay, so since comment was to me, it depends, I say, right? So if you're taking, you know, virgin grass prairie site, and you build any construction, bring any construction to it, you know you're going to damage and you're going to hurt the environment, right? So you're going to hurt the biodiversity. But if you're dealing, like in my case, I'm dealing with the case where there is invasive species that's spreading out to the point that, you know, all farmers and everyone, the only way they can deal with it is with very bad chemicals. And this chemical sprayed once or twice a year throughout the land, and I can change that. You know, I can get rid of this invasive species, can plant native grass, talking to the expert who would say that this particular native grass is going to be stronger than invasive species, and over the 5 years or so, the land going to get back to restored to the original state. I do believe that it is increasing biodiversity, but, you know, you're right. So if you're going from the plot of land that was absolutely undisturbed and perfect on this 26% that's left in Alberta, then you do damage it. So it really depends case by case, right? And you just need to see what incrementally you do good or bad to the environment.
And good point with the rooftop solar. Germany made, like, the German environment of Ministry of Environment made a study, and they figured out that if Germany would be using 80% of the suitable roofs for solar, Germany could be completely powered by solar only, like no wind, no anything else, just from the rooftops. So, and if that's, and knowing that Germany has much less sprawl than Alberta or North America has, like here there must be even more suitable roofs than there. So it would be easily possible to have enough power generation. Let's not talk about how to store it and like how to have the power generation when you need it, but like if the storage would be solved, the roofs would be enough, that's for sure. So it's more about like that's something like how do politics interfere, what about incentives, and then also market mechanism. How easy is it for you, for example, to sell your solar electricity to your neighbor? If there's market mechanisms for that in place, that makes it also more viable to go on rooftops.
I've been to Germany many times, and the climate's quite different there than here. And you can work year-round in Germany, and so I'm just wondering if you have an opinion on what you think the seasonality of the ability to install here has an impact on the economics. And then for Mikhail, just the challenges of clearly you're doing pile driving in the summertime, and perhaps you could speak to how, if you could actually see ever doing that in the wintertime.
Yeah, I should not be the one saying how bad it can get here. I just saw that, like, interestingly enough, Germany had always like the decrease in feed-in tariff stupidly enough at the end of the year. So it's like 31st of December where the weather really sucks. And so during summertime, the investors were like, will I build a power plant right now, or will the module prices drop further and so on? And then in October, they would sign contracts also for rooftop solar, and then you would be installing in the crappiest weather ever. So I don't know what when it comes to impossibility, what's worse, like sleet and rain on a German rooftop at like 1 or 2 degrees plus Celsius or minus 40. Like, I mean, there's probably impossibilities of doing construction at minus 40 at one point, just for like material that won't work anymore. But like seeing that at the same time, like a lot of installs in Germany have been done in the worst conditions possible, like, yeah. I think there is a seasonality to it, but like we're not at the limits of pushing it to the, or we're not pushing it to the limit right now, what we can do, isn't it, Mikhail?
So the reality is that sometimes the project schedule dictated not by economics, but necessity to complete the project. And one of the learning, I think, from Brooks' project, which thankfully wasn't beyond our scope, but the project has been completed in the winter, which was tremendously challenging conditions after we left the site and finished it. So perfect. It's clearly that developers should and owners of the project should take into account the seasonality and plan, start of the projects early in the spring rather than kind of later in the summer to get into the winter, because eventually it's going to drive the cost down, and that's what good. And so the schedule here is more important than that schedule in somewhere else part of the world. And if a developer or owner of the projects comes from other places of the world, they don't kind of quite appreciate it and understand it. So it does drive the price up. Now, from my perspective is, I've been installing ground mount system this Tuesday, and it's still doable, and we still, I guess, keep pushing our limits. And what I couldn't do 8 years ago, I can do it right now with proper machinery and proper techniques. I can still do it, or we can still do it.
But you're from Russia.
8 years ago, I was from Russia as well.
I've worked around in different water treatment plants, and the Gold Bar wastewater treatment plant, would that get a solar farm built out there too, and on that 40 acres?
Yes, good question. So as of now, this solar farm, together with the panels on the North Service Center, there are the extent of the solar farm projects that are being planned by EPCOR right now. Yeah, we're always, I think, looking the future of, again, once this process is completed, looking at how we can further diversify our kind of energy portfolio and looking at more at renewables.
One of the things that's always impressed me about how Germany approached all this, especially in the early stages of development, was how distributed the ownership was of renewables. We got a good portion of the agriculture, the farmers are owning things, individuals are part of the essentially renewable energy market. So with the utility scale stuff, who is owning these? Are they, and what are the roles of cooperatives, for example?
Well, that's actually quite diverse as well. There was, especially before the tendering procedure was introduced, there were a lot of cooperatives, communities, etc., also like building their own systems, utility scale. Then there's of course the big players like the utilities, but also the classic solar companies, which we do have quite a few in Germany. And that was actually one big fear they had when they introduced the tendering process, that would reduce the diversity of ownership and the diversity of who could actually win a bid and build a solar farm. But that hasn't proven right. So the number of cooperatives and communities has slightly reduced, but it's still there. And in the first two tenders, a large chunk of the bidding amount went to always one big player, but they weren't able to repeat that in more than one of the bidding rounds because they'd kind of put all their eggs in one basket. And then after that, someone else got to go. And now after 12 rounds, it's quite evenly distributed again.
So were there any carve-outs in the bidding process for socially redeemable projects, for example? Extra points given?
I don't think so, actually.
Okay.
I would have to look that up, but I don't think so, no. Definitely not in the original one.
Yeah, okay.
And maybe I just want to add one, which is a real, for all the industry guys involved here, the biggest success story is one of the owners of the largest chunk of German solar power is actually a small solar company that owns now almost 0.5 gigawatt. It's Solar Park, they're called. And what they did is they were one of the first guys to realize that they were able to get project financing, could leverage equity with 90% of capital from banks. And they just built one solar park after the other, and they just used the existing parks as a sort of security for the news to build. And at the end, now those guys are owning this huge amount of parks, and it's like normal guys, it's not a big corporation or anything. And they have a revenue of, I think, 150 million Canadian dollars as income out of those existing parks that are now using just to build solar power everywhere in the globe. So it's really sometimes it's also worthwhile being in industry for a while.
On these large-scale projects, I'm just curious what the inverter power ratio would be on from the DC to the AC side. So if you were going to be producing all the power that you required for Germany with solar, what would be the strategy for displacing that excess energy that you produce during the summer months?
I guess I quickly jump in. I don't think I fully understand your question, but I'm sure there's some others here that maybe could. But the central inverters I know we're looking at are in the 2.5 to 4 MVA range. So in our case, 12 megs AC, we'd be looking at about 3 of those, depending on the arrangement and how much extra capacity are in those inverters.
I should defer this question to Gordon. Then you'll definitely get the right answer. But yeah, for me, there is no right answer. So what we do is we calculate cost-benefit analysis. So we model different systems usually to calculate the best rate of return investment. And I guess lately, when the PV modules, I think probably, far past in the history, when you do the ground mount system, you would probably get your AC/DC ratio close to 1 because PV modules were fairly expensive. You don't want to oversize DC too much. With the PV modules prices going down, you can go a little bit more aggressive, like 1.3, 1.4. So there is a little bit of room. But more often it actually comes to the size of the inverter or size of the string and those considerations. And another thing that I really like, just building the blocks. So you just model your 1 megawatt block, and then you just multiply that. That's so much easier.
And the other interesting question is also goes basically in the same direction. Like, what's the solution if you have like solar production whenever it occurs, and how do you power a whole country just based on solar? And it wouldn't be based on solar totally. It just doesn't make so much sense. But there is quite interestingly enough 2 extreme scenarios of how to solve the storage problem. And like one is sure, like get the storage systems going. And then it largely depends on how far the prices for whatever ideas there is on storage can drop versus how quickly further will drop module prices, or if there is maybe even some stuff like solar active paint lifting off the ground that you can just paint houses solar active. And there is a scenario where like one professor of Technical University in Berlin was actually saying, you know what, like maybe we don't need that much of storage, maybe just put solar everywhere and we just don't use it all the time.
Which then doesn't go with the feed-in tariff anymore.
If I have solar and then I get an electric vehicle and I live in a city, it seems to me that my vehicle is my battery. And I'm wondering how far that technology is going, because as much as I'm happy with all the money some of you entrepreneurs are making.
I think that's actually a very good question, and I took the freedom of going for the first part of the answer, because the electrical vehicles will definitely be changing the game here, also in terms of storage, because what's in the market right now is there's already the technology existing for like using a vehicle as storage. Right now what's mostly happening though is that you just like use it if you store into the vehicle if you have surplus energy from your solar system, for example. So solar system produces more than you need, you don't have any off-taker in the house running, but the car is on the charger and then it will be planned charging on that energy. And it does actually also work the other way around, though that technology is not entirely, let's say, on the point of really going into market big time, where you can actually have your car like be a battery and feed into your house once it's plugged in and you just pull from the car. But you have to see that that has some downsides. So how much convenience are you willing to give up for that to happen? Because then you might want to use your car and, well, it's unfortunately not fueled or not stored because it's been used to run the washer. That is like the level on how can that work? How can that actually be leveled here and there? That is still something that is in the pilot.
I think like a lot of it also conveniently can be solved by what's ahead of us in terms of IT and self-learning systems. Like Google Maps now is suggesting me like, I see you're at home, like typically at this time of the day you go to work, like you will have like 15 minutes of traffic, so you better get going right now because I see in your calendar first appointment is in quarter of an hour. So if we have that technology in place also for electrical vehicles, it's going to be like that. Like you're going to be driving to your office, the car is going to say, you know what, like battery is quite empty at the moment. At the same time, I see you sitting in the office for 8 hours. So why don't you just offer my battery to the grid, and then first it can be charged, then it can be discharged around lunchtime, and then in the afternoon, where typically electrical prices drop, I'm going to be charging again. And all that is going to be fully taken care of by a software, and you just like click yes on your smartphone. I'm fine with that. And in case you get a call like from your daughter, she's, I don't know, sick, you have to leave the office right away, you need the car charged. There is also a quick charging possibility that then costs you a hell of money, but never mind because you have an emergency. That technology is going to arrive sooner than later.
Okay.
I think this is future. I truly believe in it. And this technology called vehicle to grid. So when you're able to use your vehicle to sell back to the grid, there is a company in California who's been kind of well on the path for that. And what they've done is that first they set up some corporate fleet vehicles, electrical vehicles on that, and it's a vehicle to grid. Another thing that they've done is they partnered with some European utility companies like EPCOR, and basically got our infrastructure to settle and to provide that basically ancillary services to the utility. So I think this is a really good application, and I think it's truly believe it's the future. It's coming.
What are your dreams about how it should move forward?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I guess my dreams are to build sustainable society. So looking from all different angles, biodiversity, financial viability of the projects, environmental impact, everything together. That's, I think solar and renewable energy in general helps us to be more sustainable if we implement and develop it in a proper way.
I guess my dreams are for my 4 young children at home to grow up in a beautiful place, in a city. So.
Well, I can support that for our 3. Actually, my dream is that governments and people and corporations and utilities make it less complicated for us to implement that. Because I see there's a really good chance in my lifetime to see the first countries that are 100% renewable energy powered, because the technology is really there. It's really advancing, like the battery storage, the prices are dropping as fast as solar prices used to. The electrical vehicles, they are on the market, they're getting there, and they could be really taken it for everybody so much faster if not the lobbyists, the politics, the corporations, whoever has their interest and their money to lose would do so much effort to block that. And that would be my personal dream, for everybody to really just work on that together and not against each other.
Okay, so dream is like a sustainable planet. And like short-term wishes, there's 2 or 3. Like, I'd like to see a virtual net metering coming, because that would solve the problem. Like, what do the people in condominiums, how can they participate in the whole thing? Like, they could buy a share in a solar farm and then have consume from the solar farm in their condo. And the other thing is easy financing available, that you really have to sign 2 contracts. One contract is for the financing and one contract is for getting the PV system, and you just pay back the financing with your electrical bill and done. And that would be, it's not a dream, it's just something that would need to happen and would make things really easier.